Jane Britton was born in 1945 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She attended the Dana Hall School, a private school in nearby Wesley, Massachusetts. Her hobbies included riding horses, playing the piano, and painting. She went to Radcliffe College, where she majored in anthropology. After graduating magna cum laude in 1967, she was accepted in Harvard's graduate program in the field. Britton lived in fourth-floor apartment at 6 University Road, a Harvard-owned building 2 blocks from Harvard Square. The area and the building where she lived was considered decrepit and unsafe. The New York Times called it seedy and roach-infested, with peeling paint in the hallways. In 1963, another graduate student at Boston University had been sexually assaulted and murdered in her own apartment in the same building. The crime had not been solved, but 5 years later it was widely believed to be one of the 13 crimes committed by the Boston Strangler. Britton's building had no locks on the outside doors, despite constant pleas from tenants to have them installed, along with a buzzer system to restrict people from entry. Her own apartment door had a lock so dysfunctional she rarely used it. Her neighbors said she intended to move out by the building early next year. Moreover, street crime had been a huge issue in the neighborhood in the preceding months. There were reports that several Harvard students and faculty had been the victims of muggings or attempted muggings in the area. Britton had already fought an attacker in the area with a penknife, slashing his clothes in the process. On the night of January 6, 1969, the day classes resumed after the holiday break, Britton and some friends joined other anthropology classmates for dinner at a local restaurant, after which the couple went ice skating. Britton and her boyfriend, James Humphreys, returned to the apartment at 10:30 p.m. At 11:30 p.m., her boyfriend went home. At around 12:30 a.m., Britton went over to her neighbors to have a couple of drinks. The following day was a crucial day for all the anthropology doctoral candidates, and it was the day of the general examinations. Strangely, Britton did not attend, which her classmates found to be very odd, especially for someone who had shown such dedication to her studies. Her boyfriend James called her repeatedly that morning, but she did not answer. After the exam, around noon, James went over to her apartment. Since the door was unlocked, he was able to enter and immediately found her body face down on her bed with her nightgown pulled over her head and a rug and fur coat over her upper body. Thinking she was sick, he went next door and asked the neighbors if they could take a closer look. As soon as they did, it was clear that Britton was murdered in cold blood. The police were called in and they began collecting the evidence. They found that Britton had been sexually assaulted just before she was killed. After the medical examiner had looked over her body, it was discovered that there were multiple lacerations to the head with underlying skull fractures, as well as a bruise to her arm. The death was ruled a homicide by blunt force trauma, and it had occurred roughly 10 hours before the body was discovered. Nothing of value had been taken from the apartment. Investigators had difficulty determining the murder weapon, but knew it was something pointy. According to the lead detective in the case, Leo Davenport, they believed it was something sharp like a hatchet or a cleaver. Later, they speculated that a 4x6-inch stone with a pointed end, a souvenir Britton had brought home from a trip to Iran, was missing and the police couldn't find any weapon in the apartment. However, they did find a set of fingerprints which neither matched Britton nor anyone else investigators knew to have been in the apartment. Unfortunately, even after the results of the autopsy, the investigators still did not have any strong leads as of the suspect. Investigators began talking to the people that lived in the building, and a couple of people witnessed what may have happened. A child in one of the other apartments recalled hearing unusual noises on the fire escape that night. Another neighbor told the police that he had seen a man who he described to be about 6 feet tall and 170 pounds running away from the building at 1:30 a.m. Because this murder had occurred near Harvard, it generated a lot of publicity in the media. The New York Times ran several articles about the case over the following several weeks. Another thing that was very interesting about this particular case was that Britton's body, along with the floor walls and ceiling, had been sprinkled with a reddish-brown powder identified as either red ochre or iron oxide. When the police talked to a professor of anthropology about this, he said that ancient Iranians, along with many other cultures in the world, sprinkled over the dead as a funeral rite. Along with the way Britton's clothing had been used to cover her body, and the killer's apparent lack of interest in taking her valuables, led to speculation that she had been killed by someone who knew her from Harvard and not a stranger. Thinking that the killer was one of Britton's classmates, police interviewed many of the students and even filmed her funeral as a way to see if her killer might be one of the people there. Eventually, with no new leads, the case gradually became cold. However, with all the evidence taken at the crime scene well preserved, the police and the prosecutors held hope that in the future, with more improved forensic techniques, they would be able to get a proper match that was left at the crime scene. In 2017, a DNA analyst for the first time was able to recover enough DNA from the sperm left at the crime scene to perform a so-called YSTR analysis and obtain strings specific to a male depositor. When this DNA was entered into the Federal Combined DNA Index System, or the CODIS, that string came back as a soft hit on a previously unknown suspect, Michael Sumter, a convicted rapist who had died in 2001, a little over a year after he was paroled from his sentence in order to be treated for a terminal cancer. In order to be certain it was indeed Sumter's DNA, investigators needed to test the DNA at the crime scene against DNA from another closely related male, since the portion of DNA tested by the YSTR remained the same in all males of the same line. Sumter's records mentioned the brother, but his whereabouts by the mid-2010 were unknown. But when the investigators began researching his family on the Ancestry.com website, they found this brother and he provided them with a sample that matched the DNA at the crime scene. The sample provided by this brother was close enough to eliminate all but 0.08% of the male population as suspects. Michael Sumter had an extensive rap sheet. He had been convicted of 2 rapes, the second of which had occurred when he escaped from a work release program he was in while serving his sentence for the first rape. Earlier, investigators had found similar matches between his DNA and that from 2 other previously unsolved Cambridge rape murders in the early 1970s, bringing his lifetime total of known offenses to 5 rapes and 3 murders. Further investigation found other circumstantial evidence that connected him to Cambridge in 1969. 2 years before the killing, he had worked on Arrow Street, just 1 mile from Britton's apartment. In 1972, he was convicted of assaulting a woman he had met on Harvard Square subway station, just a few blocks from the University Road where Britton had lived. In November of 2018, Middlesex County District Attorney Marian Ryan announced the results of the investigation. Although Sumter couldn't be tried due to his death, Ryan stated that, quote, "I am confident that the mystery of who killed Jane Britton has finally been solved and this case is officially closed. It was the oldest cold case in Middlesex County to be solved," she added. Dawn Magyar was born on March 28, 1952, in Corunna, Michigan. She had two brothers. She graduated high school in 1970. Dawn was married to Dawn Magyar. At the time of her murder, she was just 20 years old and they had just celebrated the first birthday of their son. They lived in Chesaning, Michigan. On January 27, 1973, Dawn went grocery shopping in Oswego, Michigan. While in the supermarket checkout line, she met a friend with whom she chatted for a bit. Afterwards, she exited the supermarket and went to her car. After Dawn failed to return home that day, her husband reported her missing. The following day, police found the borrowed truck which she had been driving in the shopping center parking lot. Her purchases were inside and her keys scattered in the truck, suggesting a forceful abduction. Despite a massive search of the area involving over 4,000 local volunteers, her body wasn't found. On March 4th, about 5 weeks after she was reported missing, her body was discovered by two young brothers, Wayne and Bill Summers. The medical examiner found that Dawn had been raped and shot 3 times in the head and back with a .22 caliber gun. An autopsy indicated that she had likely been killed within 90 minutes of being abducted. The bullets were from 2 Remington and 1 Winchester brand ammo. On June 1974, more than a year after her body was found, a .22 caliber revolver, believed to be the murder weapon, was recovered from a nearby river in Owasso. The revolver was rusted and unable to fire, but still loaded. It contained 3 spent rounds that matched the brand of bullets that killed Dawn. 2 years later, in 1976, Dawn's wallet and identification were found on the bank of the nearby river in the same area where the .22 caliber gun had been found. In 1995, Michigan State Police decided to reactivate the case, hoping that the advance in DNA technology would help to eventually find the killer. In 1998, police located the gun's owner, Robert Shaw. He told authorities that he indeed owned the gun which they found, but it had been lost many years before. He was cleared in the case by DNA testing. However, a few years later, Shaw told police that he remembered that soon after they divorced, his ex-wife had dated a man named Gerald Leroy Wingert. He said that Gerald may have taken the gun at that time. Police learned that Gerald, at age 20, had been convicted in 1961 for the rape of a blind female University of Michigan student and an armed robbery of her escort in Ann Arbor Township, Michigan. He served an 8-year prison sentence and was released in 1969. He later worked as a long-haul trucker and lived in more than one state. When police learned about him in relation to the Dawn case, Gerald was 60 years old and living quietly in Center Line, Michigan, with his 4th wife. He also had a grown daughter from a previous marriage. After putting him under surveillance, the police obtained Gerald's DNA from saliva on cigarette butts, which he had used and discarded in his trash. They found that his DNA matched the samples taken from the Magyar crime scene. They also determined that Gerald had indeed been in the Owasso area visiting a friend around the time of Dawn's murder. Unable to establish any links between him and Dawn, investigators believed that he had seen the young woman in the shopping center or in the parking lot and randomly chose her as his victim. On March 7, 2001, exactly 27 years after Dawn's body had been found, who was 60 years old, was arrested and charged with Dawn's murder. He couldn't be charged for kidnapping or rape because the statute of limitations on those crimes, 10 and 6 years respectively, had expired. He was tried in November of that year at the Livingston County Courthouse. He claimed in his defense that he had consensual sex with Dawn, but the prosecutor's experts were able to testify that his DNA was left on Dawn during the brief time frame that she went missing and got killed. On November 27, 2001, he was found guilty of first-degree felony and premeditated murder. In 2002, he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Dawn's mother, Eleanor, and brother Larry and his wife were alive to see justice served for Dawn. Her father, Ralph, had died in 1988. The following case is the oldest cold case to be solved in the United Kingdom. Roy Tuttil was born in 1954 in Surrey, England, the only son of parents Dennis and Hilary. On April 23, 1968, Roy left school at 3:30 p.m. and boarded a bus with his friends. To save on bus fare in order to buy a new bicycle, he then decided to hitchhike the rest of the way home, something he did regularly. Roy was last seen in Chessington, Surrey, trying to hail a car. When he failed to arrive home, his parents notified the police. The police took a missing persons report but did not begin investigating until the following day. 3 days later, his body was found by a policeman outside the gates of Cherkley Court in Surrey. He had been strangled and sexually assaulted. Initially, the only information police had was that of a bus driver who had seen a schoolboy talking to a driver of a silver gray Austin Westminster Mark II car. The driver was described as a short, stocky man with a whitish gray hair. The same car had been reported seen near where the body was dumped. Samples taken from his body and his clothing were analyzed at that time, but provided no evidence except that the suspect was of either A or O blood group. Unfortunately, due to the lack of evidence and clues, the case stalled. Detectives, however, believed that whoever did this was a repeat offender and the murder was not a random act. In the 1970s, investigators traveled to Scotland to interview a man named Brian Longfield from Solihull, West Midlands, who had been sentenced to 2 years in prison for the attempted abduction and indecent assault of a 14-year-old boy in Aberdeen, Scotland. However, Field denied having anything to do with Roy's murder. Then, in late 1996, a partial DNA sample was recovered from samples taken from Roy's trousers, which had been kept in a freezer. In 2000, a hit came back on the DNA sample from Roy's trousers that was matched to Field, who had DNA taken when he was arrested for drunk driving in September 1999 in Birmingham. Field had been living off the radar for many years, working as a gardener. At this point, Field's criminal record included a 1969 fine for gross indecency, the 1970s assault in Aberdeen, and 2 sentences in the 1980s of 4 years each for 2 counts of unlawful sex with underage boys. Surrey police set up surveillance on Field in Birmingham in order to know his whereabouts so that they can locate and arrest him if such need would arise. On February 21, 2001, police arrested Field in his apartment in Birmingham. While in police custody, Field denied knowing Roy or having anything to do with his death. Just before Field was put into his cell for a third night, he had been asked to submit DNA samples. Field couldn't sleep that night, and the following day he confessed in detail to the abduction, rape, and murder of Roy Tuttil. He then described in great detail what happened that night. On November 15, 2011, more than 43 years after Roy's body was found, 65-year-old Field was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Roy Tuttil. Roy's parents did not live to see his murderer sentenced.